Hi everyone, welcome back to the 21 and Sensory podcast with me, Emily. On today's show, I have special guest Charli Clement. Charli is an activist, speaker, writer, creator, and lived experience expert. They are proudly autistic, ADHD, dyspraxic, and chronically ill. And Charli is particularly passionate about discussing the intersection of these conditions. Charli works with the NHS and other organisations around psychiatric inpatient care, human rights, and autism. Charli's first non-fiction book around autism and chronic illness was published by Jessica Kingsley Publishers in December 2023 and is called All Tangled Up in Autism and Chronic Illness, a guide to navigating multiple conditions. Charli has previously been a keynote speaker for the British Medical Association and given talks to NHS boards and staff, universities, city councils, amongst others, as well as having bylines in outlets such as The Independent, The Metro, The Daily Mirror, and Vice. So Charli is very busy, and I appreciate that they have taken the time to come on this podcast. So, Charli, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
No worries. It's very kind of you. Like, obviously, from that intro, you do a lot, and that must be a lot to juggle. So we're definitely going to have to chat a little bit about that, as well as your book, which is really
For
exciting.
sure. Yeah, I mean, it's been a really weird couple of months because it didn't feel real, and then it was suddenly in people's hands.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's been really lovely.
Oh, that's really exciting. I think let's try and start from like kind of a little bit of background about you and your diagnoses, and then maybe we'll talk about the book.
Sure.
So maybe we could discuss any diagnoses you have. I know I've kind of mentioned a few of them, but maybe you could just give us a little bit more background to the kind of process. And also, I have heard on a previous podcast how you found out you're autistic, and I think that's quite interesting as well, if not slightly worrying. So
Yeah, sure,
maybe we could discuss that.
sure. So I always kind of talk about the fact that my physical health and my neurodivergence journeys very much became parallel. Um, it kind of started when I was 10 and I was having issues with my legs, and I kind of always had pain like really quickly when walking and stuff like that, but I just thought that was perfectly normal. Like,
Mhm.
nobody told me that you weren't meant to have pain. So but I when I started in the scouts, you have to stand at the start with your legs together, and my knees turn inwards, and it was really hurting me. So we kind of went to the doctor, and they were like, "Oh, that is a problem actually." And I've been on my toes since I was like 3 years old as well. So kind of started being pushed pillar to post in different departments. I had genetic testing, I had MRIs, I had blood tests, I had um, like, I can never remember what it's called, but like electronic nerve testing,
Mhm.
where they like zap electricity through you,
Mhm.
and all sorts. And it took a long time before someone kind of started putting the pieces together. It wasn't until I was 17 that somebody turned around and said, "Yeah, this is hypermobility spectrum disorder, or hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos loss." It was when they were changing the diagnostic criteria, so I kind of still go between the two as to which one it is, but it's that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, and so yeah, I didn't discover that until I was 17, and discovered that I had postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome the year after that. Um, but while I was kind of going through all of that physical stuff, when I was um, 15, I started having these panic attacks, and I do think they were panic attacks, although, because we hear, we talk a lot in the community, like, was it a panic attack or was it an autistic meltdown?
Mhm.
I think it was kind of almost both, realistically. But I started having these panic attacks or these meltdowns at school, um, and yeah, it kind of triggered this whole journey where I I saw a guy for my legs, and this orthopedic guy, and he was like, "Oh, so you walk on your toes, and you're going into cams for panic attacks. Like, are you autistic?" And me and my mum were like absolutely taken aback. Like, nobody had ever said this before, never been brought up. I wasn't like any of the autistic boys I'd met, because I'd never met any autistic girls.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, it was absolutely shocking at the time. And he shouldn't have done that. But obviously, he was not wrong. So yeah, and then I was admitted onto a psychiatric unit about 6 months later, um, and I was diagnosed during my time there. So yeah, and then spent like 5 years going back and forth telling doctors about how busy my brain was all the time, and then calling that autism associated anxiety, and me kind of discovering my own ADHD at 20.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, and the dyspraxia, I don't know, I can't even remember where that comes in the timeline. Like, somewhere along the line,
Mhm.
that kind of came out as well. So it's really it's not a simple timeline. Like, it's very much it all came at different points in parallel, and they all kind of informed each other ultimately.
Mhm.
And I think that's kind of a really important aspect of my story, to be fair.
Yeah, I guess like, you know, it's not really a kind of linear thing. And also, it's really interesting, like having people on this podcast and finding out kind of how the sort of process to diagnosis happened. And a lot of people say that it was the medical route that then kind of led to, oh, actually, kind of, more mental health or like CAMS, like you said, or something like that. But it's almost like this medical model first kind of thing. And then I don't know, you almost kind of then end up going more towards like, maybe like, oh, maybe it could be like, maybe you are autistic. And for someone in a kind of, hospital medical setting to say that was quite, I guess, kind of future thinking, I guess, because I feel like a lot of kind of consultants and things aren't massively on board with all things autism.
Yeah, I mean, it was such an interesting one, because at the minute that he said that, he decided that was the case, and then he treated me very stereotypically throughout that appointment.
Mhm.
Like, he didn't really talk to me. He talked to my mom. He was very patronizing. Like, he'd made that decision,
Mhm.
um, and he also didn't realize that he'd just tipped my entire world on its axis.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a really weird one where it, like, I look back and I'm like, actually, that was a really big deal that he, as a physical health doctor,
Mm.
even like had that connection, because the whole walking on your toes autism connection is like the earliest thing we can look at for me as an autistic trait.
Mhm.
Like, that's the earliest indicator. And it's a really, really common trait. But loads of people in the community talked about that all the time, but not many doctors really made that connection. So when I look back, I'm like, he was actually ahead of his time to know that, but then
Yeah.
it led to this kind of very stereotypical um treatment after that. So it was a really interesting kind of swings and roundabouts kind of scenario.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. The fact that he was that kind of forward thinking, and but like you say, it was not delivered in the best, the appropriate way. And like you say, like it should really be a moment of like, obviously it's going to be overwhelming to be told that you might be autistic, but it should be something that brings you clarity. And that was a bit of a shocking way to deliver that.
Yeah, I mean, it was very flippant. Like,
Mm.
it was just kind of, it was almost like a footnote, like, it was a side note in what he was saying. Like,
Mhm.
he didn't realize like how much that changed for me, and just in that moment alone, and then in the next few months, like, it was just so flippant.
Mhm.
um so yeah, but it did give us that couple of months then, until I went into cams, to actually process that and start to realize what that actually meant for me. So
Mhm.
it became quite a good thing, but yeah, not in the moment.
Mhm. And I probably know the answer to this question, but were Cam's understanding of the fact that you thought you might be autistic when you did go into like a kind of inpatient setting, or was that kind of later down the line that they kind of put you forward for diagnosis?
So I'm one of your very rare cases where community cams, the psychologist that I saw, he was a really great guy,
Mhm.
and they really gave me the time of day at that point. I had real difficulties with psychiatrists
Mhm.
in cams, but the psychologist that I saw originally the first time, and I had him for quite a long while. He was actually really good, and he kind of, he went through all these questions, and he was like, "Do you know where I'm going with this?" And we were like, "Actually, yeah, we do."
Mhm.
And then I kind of ended up in the unit, and it was a bit more. I don't know. It wasn't that they didn't believe that I was autistic or that they didn't think that I needed assessing or anything, but they were just. I shouldn't have ended up in that environment. Like, fundamentally, the reason that
Yeah.
I was there, I just shouldn't have been there. So they kind of. I was not given as much time and space for understanding, for assessment and stuff, because I just shouldn't have been there. So it's kind of again, like a bit of a. I was really lucky in some ways, and
Mhm.
then really unlucky in others, I guess.
Mhm. Well, it's nice. It's nice to hear of a positive interaction at a kind of community level with like a professional. Like that's great. Me starting that sentence being like, I think I probably know the answer, but how how understanding were they? So that's nice. That is nice to hear, and the fact that you had to be like, this isn't the case at all, but I got lucky. Like, you know, the fact that you think you got lucky, but were placed in somewhere totally, unsuitable, as a result. It's tricky, isn't it? Because at the time you weren't to know, but this hindsight gives you that kind of like, do you know what, that wasn't the right setting. But the fact that you think you're kind of lucky, even just for finding a good healthcare professional, like, says a lot, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I always kind of say that, and then I'm like, but I shouldn't be. Like,
Yeah, it should be a
it's
given.
yeah, it's a really bittersweet one, I think.
How did you manage with your other comorbid conditions, like when you were inpatient? Like, were they understanding of that as well as the fact that you might be autistic?
No. My physical health was like not looked after at all when
Hmm.
I was inpatient. Um, I was on a very small inpatient ward, which obviously at the time I didn't know that because I'd never been on another ward.
Hmm.
But now I go and part of my job is to go around other units and tell them what the sensory environment is like for me and what needs changing about it. So I've been around like countless others now.
Hmm.
But at the time, I didn't know it was a really small environment. We didn't even have like garden or grounds that we could just go out into. You had to like get to a certain level of leave before you could even go around the grounds.
Okay.
Um, and it was basically two corridors, like no stairs, nothing. It was just two corridors, and there wasn't really much space for exercise, for support with any of that. There was like yoga once a week, but you're not really meant to do yoga when you're hypermobile anyway, because you kind of bend
Yeah.
you too far, and so there wasn't any real support for physical health for anyone really.
Hmm.
And then for me, so essentially with like HSD and EDS, your joints are very lax. And then so it's kind of your muscle tone that holds you up. This is the way they've always explained it to me anyway.
Okay.
Is the muscle tone kind of holds you up instead of the joints because they're so lax.
Hmm.
And so you kind of have to keep up that muscle tone. and I lost it all while I was on the unit. And so I had about 2 years after I was admitted where I physically couldn't stand up. I just fell to the ground like the moment that I kind of stood up.
Okay.
So that's when I started using walking sticks at 16, 17.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that was really hard.
Mm.
Like I had already struggled so much to get back into society on a kind of social level. Like I really struggled to get back into the world and into life after that experience, and then to kind of also be dealing with such a difficult thing with my physical health as well at the time. And I was literally doing my GCSEs at this point as well.
Oh my God.
So it was a lot. Like it was a lot to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, so we kind of discovered more and more about my physical health after that experience, because it almost accelerated a lot of stuff. Like my chronic fatigue and my chronic pain and stuff has always
Mm-hmm.
been amplified and worsened since that experience. Like it's almost like it kind of accelerated everything, deteriorated everything. So it's really difficult actually.
Yeah. I mean, even just your teenage years in general are stressful, but to also be like, in the middle of GCSEs and struggling not only, to come to terms with all the things that you're trying to manage, but also, you know, having your mental health and your physical health and, worrying about sitting exams. It almost feels like the last thing you need to worry about.
Yeah, absolutely. I in terms of like I wrote for the Metro a couple of years ago about using mobility aids when you're young.
Mm.
And I wrote a line in there about, so the first day that I started using a walking stick at school was the day of my biology GCSE exam.
Oh, okay.
And I was genuinely more nervous about going into school with a walking stick than I was about that exam.
Mm.
Like that exam was the piece on the side. Like I was so unbelievably anxious. And yeah, it was really hard actually. And like I was at that school then for like another 2 years because I went there for sixth form, and I was still using walking sticks throughout that time. And you get all sorts of comments and stares and stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, as an autistic person, school's hard enough. Like I was already trying to mask and fade into the background,
Mm-hmm.
and then suddenly I've got this like very visible indicator of something else.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a really interesting kind of time for me.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you saying about like being nervous about going to school with a mobility aid, because my sister also had the same experience. Because when you were talking about POTS, that was quite interesting because my sister also has POTS. She struggled massively going into secondary school with a walking stick, and she was given like a lift key and stuff. Like the school were, pretty decent about making sure she was accommodated, but like exactly like you, she was more nervous about you know, being seen with this mobility aid than she was about, her studies in general and, coming up to her GCSEs as well. Like, it's sad that having a mobility aid and showing a kind of visible disability is, I don't know, why does it open up the floor for questions? Like,
Well, I mean, absolutely. Like you get it from all angles. Like I get it from younger people because they don't understand, but I get it more from older people who, I'm too young for that. And people try and help me off trains, and then I get like I nearly fell in the gap between the train and the platform a couple of years ago because this woman like yanked me as I was trying to get down off the train. And
mm,
I'll go into a theatre and they'll be bag checking, and then it'll be like, what happened to you? And
whoa.
it's just like it shouldn't open me up for like, are you asking everyone about their medical history or just those of us who have got something visible?
Mm,
Because I just don't understand why it makes people think it's like an open book, like it's an
Yeah.
invitation. I find it very difficult. I think with time you get better at either just kind of batting against it and just like not really saying much, or sometimes I kind of go for the more satire piece sometimes if I can be bothered. But
Hmm.
yeah, it's really hard. Like it just automatically opens you up to so much.
Yeah. And I kind of feel like, you saying you should, you're getting used to it. You shouldn't have to get used to it. Like, it's invasive. And, like, especially if you're on a day out or something and, just getting up and out of the house is a lot, when you're autistic, let alone when, you have a chronic illness, I can imagine. Like, surely that affects, like, how do you not let it affect your day kind of thing as well? Like, just the fact that people think they're entitled to know such private stuff, it's really frustrating to hear that you're having to, just be like, oh, I'm getting good at, batting it away. Like, why, why,
Yeah.
why are people asking? Why?
Well, yeah, and I mean, like, I really struggle with one-to-one interaction anyway.
Mhm,
Like, I can speak in front of 1,000 people, but put me in a one-to-one scenario, and I find that very, very difficult.
mhm,
Like, I still, a lot of the time, cannot order for myself in a restaurant or at a coffee shop. Like, that takes a lot for me, like, a lot of scripting, a lot of masking, a lot of kind of hyping myself up beforehand. Like
mhm,
it's not something that comes easily. So then when you've got people coming and asking you invasive questions, you're being thrown into that one-to-one scenario that you struggle with as an autistic person anyway.
mhm.
And yeah, it's like really, it's not only invasive, but it just pushes against what I'm already trying not to have to deal with almost.
Yeah, massively. And I think, again, a bit like me saying, like, the exams are the last stress you need. Like, people asking you such, like, blunt, invasive questions is the last thing you need when you're just trying to manage your own, like, health and well-being. And I remember also kind of you mentioning about the things you've sort of written. I remember reading an article last year. I think it was on the Unmasked website, about kind of understanding your identity and how you might kind of sort of come to terms with being asexual. And I think this is also a really interesting discussion because I think a lot of autistic people, um, from the kind of community that I'm part of online, like, it's something that sort of after maybe having an autism diagnosis or realizing that you're autistic, like, I feel like people then are able to kind of research more into, like, what they might identify as, both like in terms of like sexuality and gender. Like, how did you kind of come to realize that you might be asexual?
So I had never. So for context, I'm asexual and demi-romantic, which
Mhm,
is like an identity that falls on the aromantic spectrum, and is essentially about you needing like a really severely strong emotional bond before you start to feel any attraction.
mhm,
Which a lot of people believe that that's what everyone is like, but it is a really specific experience. And so that part came much later. But I'd never really had crushes. I was never one of those people who, like, people would be like, oh, like, what celebrity do you fancy? And I'd be like, none. Like, I, I don't understand what you're asking me.
mhm,
That sort of thing. So I'd kind of grown up, like, feeling like an anomaly in terms of all of that. Like, I just never engaged with any of that. And so I kind of got to 14, and I think I seem to remember that I think I went through a bit of a phase of believing that it must mean that I was gay or lesbian,
mhm.
because I was like, well, if I don't like boys, then surely,
Yeah.
um, and but I kind of had a I kind of I had a few months, and I was like, no, I don't like girls either. And I was a Tumblr teenager. I was
Mhm,
very much Tumblr, YouTube, that kind of vibe, and came across this concept of asexual on Tumblr, and kind of had this like I don't I only remember it really vaguely, but I kind of do have this kind of memory somewhere of that feeling of like, oh, like that could be me,
Mm-hmm.
like that could explain my experience, like actually maybe I'm not broken. And I think most, like a lot of us have that experience with autism, but I definitely had it
Yeah.
with being ace as well, where I kind of went, there are other people like this.
Mm-hmm.
And I got told a lot that I'd grow out of it. Everyone kind of assumed that I'd be a late bloomer, or
Yeah.
whatever, and or like eventually I'd kind of get to an age where I'd want to have sex, and that would change it all, or that it was hormones. When I was on the psych unit, I was told that it was because I was autistic. Like, you get all sorts kind of back and forth, but I knew, and I
Mm-hmm.
came out. I came out at 14, and yeah, so I discovered the autism a year later, and now I can kind of go, because we know that autistic people are more likely to be asexual. We don't
Mm-hmm.
really know why. Like, I have my suspicions, but we don't know if it's like a biological thing or a social thing, or what. I have a feeling that it could be any combination of all of it,
Yeah.
really. Probably different for different people.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, for me, I used to say that they were separate of each other, my autism and my asexuality. Like, I used to be very militant about the fact that they did not cause each other, and I don't necessarily believe that they do cause each other, but
Mm-hmm.
I definitely think that they do interact now. Like, I have much more of an understanding of the fact that they do kind of still intertwine within me as a person,
Yeah.
which I kind of find has been a really interesting journey, because that's like nearly 10 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
which is wild. So yeah, but like, I always tell the story because I've come out to my mom twice now, because I came out as non-binary about a year and a half ago now as well, and
Mm-hmm.
both times I've come out in the car.
It's the best place, isn't it, for
Yeah, this seems to
convos?
be like a canon event. Like, this seems to be an experience a lot of us have, where we come out in the car. And I think my suspicion is because we don't have to look at each other.
Yes.
Because there's that lack of eye contact. You're in a space together where you've kind of got to stay. Like,
Mm.
it's like a liminal space, isn't it? So,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, yeah, it's been a really long journey, and kind of understanding where my romantic orientation sat was a much longer journey as well.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you saying like how you feel like, being ace and being autistic are separate from each other, but you can see that kind of crossover. And I guess also in terms of like maybe like sensory wise as well, maybe that kind of crosses over both.
Yeah, I think the sensory aspect. So we talk about how asexuality isn't inherently about the action of sex.
Mm.
That kind of comes on its own spectrum almost. So I sit on the sex repulsed, sex averse side of that scale,
Mm-hmm.
whereas you can be like neutral about that, or you can be someone who does have sex, and you can be asexual and sit anywhere within that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, that kind of sex repulse, sex averse part, that is definitely sensory. Whether my asexuality in terms of feeling attraction is about my autism, I
Yeah.
don't know, but I definitely think that aversion to action is in part sensory, for sure.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, isn't it, how they all, I don't know, just everything overlaps, and it's really hard to know what's down to what, but I guess that is just life.
Oh, absolutely. Like, I feel like my whole thing is that I try to kind of untangle these links, and it is not easy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not simple.
I feel that links beautifully to your book called All Tangled Up. Like you quite literally are saying, like, it's hard to separate, autism, chronic illness, multiple conditions all at once. Like,
Yeah.
how did you? This is a beautiful segue, but how did you kind of? I don't know. How did you arrive at writing a book? Where did you kind of? Was it something you always wanted to do, or was it a kind of opportunity that arose? Like, it'd be interesting to know.
So I've always been like into writing. I did NaNoWriMo at the age of like 11.
Oh wow!
Um, like not the full 60,000. I think I did like 12,000 or something. But
Still,
it was like at the time, like I don't know how no one realized I was autistic when I was writing 12,000 words in a month at the age of 11.
yeah.
Like but so I've always been into writing. Writing a book was kind of always one of those, like when I was growing up, that was like, I'm gonna do that for sure.
Mhm.
And then when I was, a teenager and I was going through these, I was in the mental health system and all of this stuff. I kind of I kind of let go of all my dreams in that period. Like I feel like it's very hard to be thinking about your future when you're kind of being institutionalized in that way, like
Mm.
where you get so stuck in that system. But coming out of that, kind of starting my career, understanding who I was, all of that at like 1920, I somebody from my publisher had reached out about a year and a half before I proposed the book.
Oh, okay.
um, they'd kind of reached out and been like, I think I had offered to be like an interviewee in one of their other books, and that actually nothing came of that particular one. But they kind of were like, "Oh, if you've got any ideas, like let us know."
Mhm.
And I didn't have any ideas at the time, and I was not in a good place at that point. I had quite a difficult year in my second year of uni, and so it kind of just was there. Like I was like, oh, I'm really flattered, but like no.
Mhm.
um, and then about a year and a half later, I took a year out of uni because of my crisis that I ended up in, and I kind of started to really see the connections between the two. Like it was something that I'd always been aware of because I was experiencing it. I was going through all these different healthcare systems. I was discovering all these different diagnoses, but I hadn't really put together how society impacted them together. I hadn't really looked at how they impact each other in terms of sensory and all these other things that I explore in the book.
Mhm.
And I kind of started to talk about it online a little bit and like tweeting about it a little bit, like tiny little anecdotes. And eventually I was kind of like, oh, like this is a real thing. Like this is a major thing, like
Mhm.
both in our own bodies and in society. So I kind of just reached back out and I was like, I know it was a year and a half ago, but like I've got this idea.
Mhm.
So yeah, kind of went from there and went through the process, and wrote most of it on my year out of uni, and then the last chunk when I had come back. Um, so yeah, it's definitely a kind of serendipity thing, because if I hadn't have had that year out of uni, I would not have had the space and time to
Yeah, I was
to
going to say,
process it and write it really.
yeah, like to study and write a book would have been a lot.
Yeah, I mean the term that I did where I was doing both was like at the end was really hard work.
Mhm. Yeah, I can imagine. Like, that's a lot to kind of be disciplined about, obviously doing your uni work as well as, trying to make kind of deadlines for a book as well. Sounds scary. um,
Yeah, I mean, for me, through the whole process, it was all about external accountability. So I was meeting not my agent, I was meeting my editor, like monthly from the start. I kind of said to them, like, if we don't have meetings, I will not write this book, because I'd essentially like get to the point in the month where I had like a week before the meeting and I'd kind of be like, oh, actually, I should write some words now. Like,
yeah.
actually, I really ought to like do some work.
I guess it
So
gives you that kind of not only visual of this is coming, I need to show something, but also the like accountability of, you want to show up with something.
yeah, I mean, I'm very much not someone who can, like, people will be like, make your own deadlines, make your own rewards. And I'm like, but they're fake. They're not real.
Yeah.
I know they're not real. I could give myself that reward right now.
Yeah.
Like, I don't need to do anything for that if I'm giving it to myself. That's just how I don't know whether it's the ADHD or whether it's kind of the literal thinking or what, but I
Mm.
just can't do it. Like, I just don't work that way.
Mm-hmm. And also, like, I feel like if it comes from a kind of place of authority, you're like, oh, I have to do this.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure.
And I was reading that you have, I haven't read the book yet, but I know that you've included lots of like profiles, like short profiles from different people, which I think is a good thing to highlight. You know, it's not just you speaking in this book. Could you kind of explain, did you do like kind of interviews with people to include?
Yeah, so the book features, I want to say it's about 20 different people.
Okay.
Um, and that was my intention pretty much from day one. One, because I've only got certain chronic illnesses, like I don't have every chronic illness. And I'm only one version of the autism spectrum as well.
Mhm.
Um, like, I couldn't have written this as like the guide that it is without other people. Like, it's not a memoir, it's not about me.
Mhm.
It has my story in it for sure, and it is informed by my story, but it isn't a memoir. So I think it's got about 20 people in it. And I had a really interesting time where I kind of thought that I had to do all the interviews by Zoom just because that's what other people did. So
Mhm.
I did the first one by Zoom and then didn't transcribe it for like 6 months because I just couldn't. Like, I just could not get my brain to do it. So the rest of them, apart from a couple of people who really needed it to be by Zoom, the rest of them I did by email. And actually it worked better because then everyone could pick which questions they wanted to do. They could take as much time as they wanted.
Mhm.
They could like write as little or as much as they needed to. So it was much better all round. But it was one of those kind of social norm things where I just assumed that I needed to do it like that.
Yeah.
But it was really important to me that that's how it happened because I was so insistent that this wasn't just about me, and I think it has worked out well. It's got people of different genders. It's got people from different backgrounds, lots of different races and versions of um, like combinations of disability and different parts of the autism spectrum and like all sorts basically, like as much as I could get different intersectionality in there
Mhm.
I did. Like, obviously, I can look back and go, oh, actually, maybe it would have been good if there was another person from X background or like this experience. Like, I couldn't get it all in the time and the space that I had.
Mhm.
But I really wanted to try and make sure there was the biggest variety that I could in there to kind of. I think it's good for representation for other people to see themselves in those people. And I've
Mhm.
certainly had lots of people say, actually, I really saw myself in that anecdote or whatever. Um, and also just for people to understand how different facets of society impact this. How does race impact this? How does gender impact this? And that was really important for me to kind of try and get across.
Mhm. And also the sheer amount of, you've covered things like navigating your own diagnosis and healthcare, but also like managing pain and sensory needs, all the way to like ableism and like kind of medical misogyny and things like that. Like, you've packed so much into this book alongside, different accounts from different people. Like, I feel like, you're saying like there's only so much you could fit in, but the fact that you managed to fit as much as you did in was very impressive.
It was definitely a process. I think it was really interesting because like there's a couple of chapters that weren't in my proposal at the beginning. Like writing the book, I kind of went, oh, actually, like I really need to talk about this thing, or somebody would say something in an interview, and I'd go, oh, actually, like that's really important.
Mhm.
And there's definitely stuff in there that I don't think got enough time and space. Um, so who knows for more books, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think. it was a really interesting process trying to work out like how many words do you give this thing, or like, do I include that? Is that important enough? Definitely a process.
Yeah, I bet. And like, how did you find the kind of, I know you did like a like book launch event, and how did you find the kind of marketing side of things as well? Because I think a lot of people don't realize that, okay, you're an author, you've written this book, but you've also got to do a bit of everything. Like you've got to be like someone that self promotes and does like PR as well. Like, how did you
Yeah.
find that side of things?
Yeah, so yeah, I've pretty much had to do most of that myself,
Mhm.
personally. It's different by different publishers,
Yeah.
but yeah, I've pretty much done it all by myself. I've had quite a lot of privilege in that I access to work. I do get access to a virtual assistant, so I have had some support in that process.
Mhm.
And I paid my lovely friend Ellie Perkins to do my branding, and she's brilliant. So I've had like little bits of support that I've kind of put together to make it an easier process.
Mhm.
But it is hard. Like you're not just the writer. Like you have to be all these different bits and bobs, that I think people don't necessarily see in at the front of it all.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been really interesting. I think for me, because mine came out like 4 days before Christmas,
Mhm.
and so it meant people kind of got it in dribs and drabs. Like it kind of wasn't this like massive thing on the day, and I thought I was going to be disappointed about that, but actually that kind of worked out in my favor because I was so overwhelmed.
Mhm.
And I think that actually people getting it over kind of the space of about a week, and people, sending me lovely messages over a longer period and stuff, made it a much easier thing to process, and that kind of overwhelm, whilst difficult, was
Mhm.
actually lesser than it could have been.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. You know, that time of year anyway is pretty overwhelming as a
Yeah,
kind
for
of
sure.
holiday season, let alone trying to kind of launch a book. So I'm kind of glad that you felt that it did kind of work in terms of the pace, and hopefully meant that you didn't feel as overwhelmed, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. I think it worked out in the end. It was one of those things where you feel like you're going to be disappointed. Again, it's a social norm thing, like, oh, it
Yeah,
should be this massive big day, and then it kind of wasn't. And I feel like I should have been disappointed about that, but actually, kind of, it worked for me.
that's good. I think that's the like important thing, isn't it? And yeah, I've seen loads of people chatting about it and reviewing it. We'll mention at the end where people can obviously order your book from. But I also wanted to kind of touch upon, like, we've spoken a lot about sort of your background and kind of touched upon like some of the work you do in terms of, going into places like psychiatric wards and things like that, and telling organizations how they could be kind of more sensory friendly. But what do you do in any, that's if you have any downtime, like what do you enjoy doing just for you, just for Charlie? Like any hobbies, special interests? Like I know obviously you do a lot of social media, like content creation and things. Like what do you like to do?
So, this is definitely something I'm still working on. I feel
Hmm.
like the last few years I've been like very work and degree focused. Like, when I feel like when you're chronically ill, you do so much resting,
Hmm.
and then the rest of the time is like, how much work can I get done so that I'm prepared for when I next flare up.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to step back from that attitude and really give myself the time and space. I've always been a big reader, so that's always been like a big part of my life, and I can't imagine it not being. I like a lot of non-fiction. Give me a book about capitalism and I am happy. But also, I'm multifaceted. I absolutely love a slightly trashy romance book any day.
Ah.
So whenever I make content about books, I always feel like it's a bit two sides of a coin.
Hmm.
So yeah, I love that. I'm trying to pick up some other hobbies. So like I did a lino printing workshop a couple of weeks ago on a residential,
Oh,
and
cool.
apparently now I'm gonna like I bought a kit and stuff, so apparently I'm gonna do that.
Amazing.
It's yeah, really interesting. I'm a big theatre goer. I love that.
Mhm.
And really trying to get into films now as well. Like I've never had the concentration for films, or so I thought.
Yeah.
But now I kind of have worked out that if I like do colouring during them, or like if I'm in the cinema, as long as I have like a secondary stimulation via like a snack, like I actually can do that focus. So I've been really enjoying actually getting into films where I've spent years basically going, oh no, that's not for me.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Oh, well, I'm glad that you're like kind of finding the little, the little things that bring you joy. And that sounded like such a like ADHD thing to do, to be like, I tried a thing and now I'm going like all in and buying like everything to do with it, and I'm totally behind that. I love
Yeah,
that.
yeah, on the day I was like, oh, maybe this is gonna be my new thing. And
Hmm.
everyone was like, okay. And I was like, no, you don't understand. Like, I came home and 2 days later I was like, I'm buying a kit.
Hmm. That's
I
the
don't know how long
thing.
it'll last, but I'm enjoying it right now.
That's good though. And I've also done like lino like printing in the past. It's really satisfying, but like, oh my god, do you have to watch your fingers for like
Yes,
trying not to
it's
cut yourself?
not the most dyspraxic friendly hobby I could have picked,
Well,
but it's fine. I haven't cut
yeah.
myself yet. So.
Yeah, just always cut away from yourself. That's my top tip.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm glad you've been able to like, I think it is good to have like creative outlets, because I kind of find as well like you're like doing social media content and like graphics for social media is great, but
Yeah.
it starts to feel more and more like work when
Work.
actually you start it. I don't know if you did as well, but you start it from a kind of more passion, or like, it's an interest kind of thing. But yeah, you've got to still keep, things that you enjoy doing, not just for work. Otherwise, it will always feel like work.
Yeah, I mean, like last year, I was having conversations with my ADHD coach at the time and my therapist, and I kept kind of saying, like, I don't have a hobby. And
Hmm.
I did really. Like, I did have things, but I didn't feel like I had things because I wasn't nurturing them. Like, I wasn't giving them the time because
Hmm.
like I say, like with chronic illness, you're always waiting for that next flare up and stuff. So it's so easy to be like, I just need to work. Like, I constantly just need to work. And I was working like all the time that I wasn't resting.
Hmm.
And actually, that's no more productive than taking a couple of hours off and going to the cinema. Like,
Yeah.
because I was working, but I was like, between the ADHD freeze and the chronic illness, I was just like sat at my desk for hours on end, actually not doing anything. Like, I
Hmm.
was working all the time, but I wasn't producing anything. And so now I'm a lot better at going, look, I'm not working right now. Let's just stop. Let's just do something else. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, you're not a failure for that.
Hmm.
And I think that's been like a really long process of learning that, to be honest, I'm still on.
Hmm.
So yeah.
That's really interesting, because, you saying that you're like, I need to work until I, can't work anymore, and then need that time to kind of recover. But actually, the fact that you were working to that extent probably meant that you were going to burn out quicker, kind of thing, rather than, like you saying, having like regular sort of, 2-hour breaks or like a day off kind of thing. But it's hard to see that when you're in it, isn't it? Like, it's only with hindsight where you're like, actually, I'm working myself too hard here.
Yeah, and I think understanding, like, I talk in the book about autistic burnout and compared with and intertwining with chronic illness flare ups,
Mhm.
and how they come together, and often one feeds the other, and actually understanding that and kind of mitigating that has been a really important process for me.
Mhm. But I also feel like a lot of people, like employers, wouldn't necessarily understand that, you're constantly having to work around your chronic illness and sometimes work through it. Like, I feel like a lot of people don't realize that, that it's not the standard way of working just to get up, go to work, come home. Like there's so much in kind of working from home and having an environment that works for you, and like especially as someone who's autistic and like you said, like having like a chronic illness, like it's important to just be able to like work as and when you can and when you're feeling your best kind of thing. And I feel like we've kind of gone backwards a bit since the pandemic in terms of people understanding that, you know, there's different ways of working. I feel like a lot of people are being forced back into offices, but I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I've definitely seen a shift back into these attitudes of like you have to be in the office, or if you're not in the office you should be grinding yourself to the bone. Like
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for me, like freelancing is a blessing and a curse. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
so good for me as a chronically ill person to be able to work around myself, and you know, like as an autistic person I find it really useful too, because it means I can go and do a food shop in the day whilst the shops aren't busy, and then
Yeah.
work in the evening when everyone is in the supermarket, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also like not great for me in terms of social isolation, and obviously you don't get any sick pay, and
Yeah.
sort of thing. So it's definitely a pros and cons scenario, and I do talk about it in the book a little bit as well, actually,
Mm-hmm.
because it's one of those things where a 9 to 5 would never be accessible for me, I don't think. But actually, like I am definitely still learning about boundaries and structure when it comes to freelancing, because I'm definitely not there yet.
Mm-hmm. And also, like as a freelancer, you become the kind of HR and admin and
Yeah,
marketing of yourself, and just managing that, as well as obviously the kind of day job side of things. That, you know, it's tricky because there are so many pros and cons to being freelance or working full time. But yeah, like you say, you don't have those benefits of like sick pay or like a set amount of holiday kind of thing that you
holiday.
have to have. Like you've got to set that for yourself, which must be quite like tricky.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm very open about the fact that like I don't really take any holiday, which is really bad of me. It's something that I'm working on.
Mm-hmm.
But last year everyone was like, "Charlie, you just need to take a week off. Like you're so burnt out, just take a week." And then I did, and I came back worse
Okay.
because I really struggled then to get back on the horse, like from a task initiation ADHD point of view and autistic inertia,
Mm-hmm.
but also just because like the rest of the world had kept turning.
Yeah.
So I'm still working on like how do I make this work for me? Like I cannot go on like this, but equally, like how do I make it work so that I don't come back worse off?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what the answer is to that at the
Yeah.
moment. So yeah, it can be really hard.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like that, like, even just like working full time when they're like, oh, like Emily, you need to take holiday. Like, you're right. Like nothing stops. Like if everyone took holiday at the same time, then
Yeah,
maybe it would be better. But you're right. You're just kind of overthinking, like, you know, everything's still going on kind of without you, sort of thing. Like, what you're going to come back to. And you're right. Like getting back into things is harder than just not taking the break in the first place.
yeah. I often say, I've said to a few people lately, I'm like, I wish I could just freeze the world. Like I
Yes.
can keep going and I'll just get all my tasks done, and then I can unfreeze it and everyone else can start again.
Yeah.
And I think it's why like I really struggle at Christmas, like massively.
Hmm.
I do not do well at that time. But on a work perspective, it's the only real time that everyone kind of stops, and you
Yeah.
do get that moment of like breathing room.
Hmm.
So it's really interesting. I really want to. When I graduate in the summer, before I kind of do my next thing, I really want to take stock of some of this and go like, how can I actually make this work?
Hmm.
Because it clearly, like the way that I've been doing it the last few years is not really sustainable.
Hmm. Also, that really reminded me of I don't know if you know the series Bernard's Watch. It was like a old school TV like children's series.
I don't think I do.
Oh, you have to Google it after this. It was basically about a boy that could stop time with like a
Oh,
stopwatch, and it was so good. And I was just like, oh, you need like a Berners watch.
genius.
We haven't. I know we've mentioned that you're obviously studying at uni, but what are you actually studying? I don't think we mentioned the actual like degree you're doing.
Yeah, so I did politics and international relations,
Oh, okay.
and I basically did 2 years full time,
Mhm.
and then kind of fell into crisis and had a lot of difficulties in my second year, which was the kind of main lockdown kind of uni year,
Yeah.
and then took my year out, kind of started building my career accidentally during that time, and then about a year and a half ago came back part time. So last year and this year I've been doing my third year over 2 years. So just
Oh,
finishing that
okay.
up right now. I'm writing my dissertation, which is on autism and capitalism. So yeah.
Oh, exciting. How's the dissertation going? Because I know it can feel like a bit of a slog. Like,
Yeah, I mean it's hard work, but I'm really enjoying it in a way. Like
oh, that's
I
good.
I am really passionate about it, and it's kind of not really something that's been massively looked into.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's hard because a lot of it is kind of about like the government not supporting disabled people and eugenics and stuff like that. That's obviously not great to read about your yourself and your community.
Yeah.
But it is fascinating. So I'm sure in about a month's time I'll be in absolute bits about it. So come back to me then when I'm in pieces instead of right now where I'm like, oh, this is fine.
Yeah. Right now, you're like, I've chosen a really interesting topic. Like, I'm really passionate about it. In a month's time, you'll be like, do not talk to me
Yeah,
about it.
I'm not naive to the fact that it is, yeah, time is slipping.
How many words does it have to be? Have you got like a word count you have to?
Yeah, so it's only 9 to 10,000. So
Okay.
it's, yeah, actually, I could probably do with like another five realistically. So we'll see how that goes.
I always think it's a good, like, when you find that you write too much, it's always better to have too much and cut down than too little and be like, oh,
Yeah,
how do I like beef this up a bit?
yeah, for sure, for sure.
So where can people buy your book? Where can people find you on the internet? All of the things. How can we promote you basically?
Okay, so in terms of the book, pretty much any of your retailers, Amazon, Waterstones, bookshop.org, like they should all either have it or be able to get it.
Mhm.
So wherever you normally get your books, and yeah, that's All Tangled Up in Autism and Chronic Illness. And then I am at Charli Clement _ everywhere, I think.
Mhm.
And on Instagram, I also am starting to build at All Tangled Up _ as a little community space and talking about the book and things. So things to come there as well.
Ooh. Oh, I'll have to have a look at that and follow it. And are you like, can we promote your freelance side of things? Like, are you free at the moment or not for freelance work as well?
Yeah, so things are definitely trying to finish up my degree until April, but I am super open for speaking and writing and creating and all sorts of things like whatever people might want me for.
Okay, amazing. I will make sure to pop all your links in the show notes to all the many things that you do. I was looking on your website. I was like, whoa. I was
Yeah,
like,
well, oh, yeah. I mean, the website's due an update. But yeah, it is busy for sure.
see, that's another thing to add to your list. We've got to make your list shorter, not longer. Well, thank you so much for having a chat with me. I can't believe we've been speaking for an hour. It's gone super quick.
No, super quick. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you.